In this episode, we are moving into one of the most practical and important parts of risk identification because organizations cannot manage risk well unless they first learn how to spot where threats may come from and where weaknesses already exist. Identifying threats and vulnerabilities to people, processes, and technology means looking at the organization as a connected operating environment rather than as a pile of separate systems and policies. For a brand new learner, this matters because risk rarely appears in only one form. A malicious actor may exploit a technical weakness, but that same event may also depend on a human mistake and a poor process that allowed the mistake to spread. Once you start seeing how those pieces connect, risk becomes easier to understand in a realistic way. The goal is not to become suspicious of every person or every tool. The goal is to understand where the organization may be exposed so it can reduce the chance of harm and improve its ability to detect and respond when something goes wrong. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to start is by separating a few ideas that are often blended together too quickly. A threat is something that could cause harm, such as a cybercriminal, a dishonest insider, a software bug, a severe weather event, or even a careless action by a well-meaning employee. A vulnerability is a weakness that makes it easier for that harm to occur, such as poor password practices, missing approvals, weak system design, unclear ownership, or outdated software. Risk emerges when a threat has an opportunity to exploit a vulnerability and create business impact. This distinction matters because people sometimes talk about every problem as if it were the same type of thing. In reality, an organization needs to know whether it is dealing with a dangerous actor, a weak condition, or the combination of both. Once that becomes clear, the organization can think more intelligently about what must be corrected, monitored, or accepted rather than simply describing everything as a general security problem. People are often the first area discussed in this topic, but it is important to approach that carefully. Identifying threats and vulnerabilities related to people does not mean assuming employees are careless or disloyal by default. It means recognizing that human beings work under pressure, make mistakes, respond to urgency, trust familiar patterns, and sometimes act without seeing the full consequences of a choice. Those ordinary human realities can create openings that attackers or poor circumstances exploit. Threats involving people may include social engineering, insider misuse, fraud, coercion, or simple error. Vulnerabilities involving people may include lack of training, weak supervision, unclear responsibilities, excessive access, fatigue, poor judgment under time pressure, or over-reliance on a small number of individuals. For a beginner, this is one of the most useful mindset shifts in CRISC. Human risk is not only about bad intentions. It is also about the everyday conditions that make good people easier to deceive, overwhelm, or place in situations where mistakes become much more likely. When you look more closely at people-related vulnerabilities, several patterns appear again and again. One common issue is lack of awareness, where employees do not recognize suspicious requests, mishandle sensitive information, or fail to understand how seemingly small actions can create larger exposure. Another pattern is role confusion, where people are unsure who should approve access, who owns a process, who must review unusual activity, or who is responsible for escalating problems. There is also the issue of excessive trust, which can lead staff to comply too quickly with requests that appear urgent or come from someone with authority. Overprivileged access creates another vulnerability, especially when users keep permissions they no longer need or when administrators can make wide-ranging changes with little oversight. Key person dependency is equally important because an organization becomes fragile when critical knowledge sits with only one or two individuals. These are all vulnerabilities tied to people, but notice that they are rarely personal failings alone. They often reflect larger weaknesses in how the organization trains, structures, supervises, and supports its workforce. Processes are just as important as people, even though they sometimes receive less attention at first. A process is the repeatable way work gets done, including approvals, reviews, data handling, exception management, change control, onboarding, offboarding, vendor management, and dozens of other routine activities that shape daily operations. Processes matter because even skilled people working with capable technology can still create major risk if the steps around the work are weak, inconsistent, or poorly understood. A threat may enter through a process that lacks validation. A vulnerability may grow because a review step is skipped, or a small error may become a major problem because the process never included a reliable checkpoint. New learners often focus on dramatic attack scenarios and overlook routine process weakness, but in many organizations, process flaws quietly create some of the most persistent and damaging exposure. Poorly designed process can make fraud easier, hide control failure, delay detection, and allow one local problem to spread across business units or systems before anyone notices. Some process vulnerabilities are especially common because they develop slowly and start to feel normal over time. A weak approval process may allow sensitive access to be granted without enough review or business justification. A poor change management process may let system modifications happen without testing, documentation, or clear rollback plans. Incomplete offboarding may leave former employees or contractors with active accounts long after they should have been removed. Inconsistent incident escalation may cause critical warning signs to be ignored because nobody knows when or how to report them. Manual workarounds can also become hidden vulnerabilities when employees invent shortcuts outside the official process to keep work moving under deadline pressure. Those workarounds may solve a local problem while creating larger risk around data handling, validation, accountability, or continuity. The lesson here is that process vulnerabilities are not always dramatic or obvious. They often appear as ordinary friction, missing discipline, or informal habits that gradually erode control until the organization is far more exposed than leadership realizes. Technology is the third major area, and it is often the most visible because technical weaknesses are easier to imagine in concrete form. Systems may be outdated, unsupported, misconfigured, weakly monitored, poorly integrated, or overly exposed to networks or users who do not need access. Applications may process sensitive data without enough protection, store information in insecure ways, or fail to validate inputs properly. Infrastructure may include single points of failure, weak recovery capability, limited visibility, or unpatched components that attackers can exploit. Cloud services may create risk if the organization misunderstands responsibility, mismanages identity, or loses track of how data moves across providers and regions. Technology vulnerabilities matter because they often scale quickly. A single weakness in a widely used platform can affect many processes and many people at once. Still, CRISC learners should remember that technology weakness is rarely meaningful in isolation. Its significance depends on what business services it supports, what data it touches, who can reach it, and how easily the weakness can be exploited under real operating conditions. It is also important to understand that threats to technology do not come only from outside attackers. Internal misconfiguration, rushed implementation, poor maintenance, software defects, integration failures, and accidental misuse can all act as threat sources in practice. A system may become unavailable not because someone targeted it maliciously, but because a badly managed change disrupted an essential dependency. Data may be exposed not because of a sophisticated breach, but because a cloud storage setting was left open, a test environment used live records, or an application interface was misunderstood. This matters because beginners sometimes imagine threat identification as a search for villains only. Real organizations face harm from many directions, including negligence, process drift, hardware failure, environmental disruption, and misunderstood complexity. Threat identification should therefore remain broad and grounded. The question is not only who might attack. It is also what could fail, what could be misused, what could be misunderstood, and where the organization may already be operating with less margin for error than it assumes. One of the biggest insights in this topic is that people, processes, and technology do not operate separately. They influence each other constantly, and many risk events become serious only because weaknesses across all three line up at the same time. A phishing email may fool an employee because awareness is weak, but the damage becomes worse if access controls are too broad and the approval process for unusual payment requests is too informal. A software change may introduce outage risk because the system is fragile, but the real problem may also involve unclear ownership and a process that allows release without adequate testing. A data leak may begin with technical exposure, yet expand because staff do not know reporting expectations and the incident escalation process is vague. This is why strong risk identification looks for combinations rather than isolated defects. The most useful question is often not where one weakness exists, but how a threat might travel through people, processes, and technology together if the organization does not interrupt it early enough. A helpful way to identify threats and vulnerabilities is through scenario thinking. Instead of looking only at lists of weaknesses, the organization imagines realistic events and asks what conditions would allow those events to occur. What if a trusted employee receives a convincing request that appears to come from a senior executive? What if a vendor integration fails during peak business activity? What if a critical administrator leaves the organization unexpectedly and no one else understands an important process? What if a cloud service is misconfigured and sensitive data becomes visible to unintended parties? These scenarios help reveal hidden relationships between threat sources and vulnerable conditions. They also move the conversation beyond abstract security language and into operational reality, which is where business leaders and technical teams can have a more useful discussion. For a new learner, scenario thinking is valuable because it trains the mind to connect conditions, actions, dependencies, and consequences instead of treating each weakness as an isolated trivia point. Information gathering is essential here because threat and vulnerability identification depends on knowing how the organization actually works. That means reviewing business processes, system inventories, data flows, architecture information, prior incidents, audit findings, issue logs, vendor relationships, and continuity plans. It also means talking to people who understand real operational conditions, because documentation may not reveal informal workarounds, hidden dependencies, or fragile practices that only become visible during day-to-day work. A manager may know a process is critical at month end, a system owner may know a key platform is difficult to patch, and frontline employees may know that certain approvals are routinely bypassed to keep work moving. Each of those facts can change how threats and vulnerabilities are understood. Good identification, therefore, depends on both records and human insight. The organization is not simply hunting for technical flaws. It is trying to build a realistic picture of where exposure exists across the business and why certain conditions might allow harm to occur more easily than leadership expects. Context matters greatly because the same threat or vulnerability can mean very different things depending on the environment. A shared account may be a serious weakness in a sensitive processing environment, while a similar issue in a low-impact system may still matter but create less immediate business concern. A missing review step in one process may be manageable if strong compensating controls exist elsewhere, while in another process the same missing step could open the door to fraud or major data error. This is why CRISC emphasizes business context rather than mechanical scoring alone. Threat and vulnerability identification should always ask what business service is affected, what data is involved, what obligations apply, and what impact would follow if the weakness were exploited. Without that context, organizations may spend too much time on highly visible but low-impact problems while missing quieter conditions that could severely disrupt operations, damage trust, or create lasting legal and regulatory difficulty. Several common misconceptions make this work harder than it needs to be. One is the belief that identifying vulnerabilities means finding only technical flaws, when in fact weak governance, poor communication, process inconsistency, and unclear ownership can be just as dangerous. Another is the idea that if no incident has occurred yet, the vulnerability is probably not serious. In reality, many weaknesses remain dormant until timing, dependence, or threat activity changes. There is also a tendency to blame individuals for human-related exposure without asking how training, workload, process design, or access structure contributed to the situation. Some organizations assume their formal processes are working because they are documented, even though actual behavior has drifted away from written expectations. Others assume newer technology means lower risk, while ignoring the vulnerabilities created by rapid adoption, weak oversight, or misunderstanding of responsibility. These misconceptions matter because they lead to shallow identification, and shallow identification leads to risk programs that feel active but miss the very conditions most likely to create real business harm. A simple example helps tie all of this together. Imagine an organization processes customer refunds through an internal business application. On the surface, the main concern might appear to be technology, perhaps whether the application is patched and whether access is authenticated properly. But a fuller review shows that the real exposure crosses all three areas. The people issue is that staff are not well trained to verify unusual refund requests, and several employees have access far beyond what they need. The process issue is that large refunds can be approved through informal email exchanges without secondary review. The technology issue is that activity logging is incomplete, making suspicious actions harder to detect quickly. In that scenario, the threat could be an external fraud attempt, an insider abusing access, or even a well-meaning employee responding to a deceptive request. The important lesson is that the risk does not live in only one weakness. It lives in the combination of human, process, and technical conditions that allow abuse or error to succeed. When you step back and look at the whole picture, identifying threats and vulnerabilities to people, processes, and technology becomes one of the clearest ways to understand how risk actually forms inside an organization. Threats are the possible sources of harm. Vulnerabilities are the weaknesses that make harm easier, and the most serious exposure often appears when human, procedural, and technical weaknesses connect instead of remaining isolated. Strong risk identification therefore requires broad observation, careful questioning, realistic scenarios, and a constant link back to business context. For a new learner, the most important takeaway is that risk is not just something attackers bring from outside. It also grows from how the organization trains its people, designs its processes, manages its systems, and maintains visibility into the way all three interact. Once you understand that, you are in a much stronger position to recognize meaningful exposure early and support decisions that reduce risk before a threat becomes a realized business problem.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.